Hello to my 41 loyal subscribers. We are back at you with another long form video, and today we got a really interesting topic, and which will have us go once again back to Canada. Yippee! I just can't escape that country. When doing that video for Point Roberts, I had to go to British Columbia, Canada, and now this one is going to be about Saskatchewan. Hands down the most boring province in all of Canada. It is basically the Wyoming of Canada, and I'm pretty sure a lot of Canadians will agree with me on that. Now, I do want to give some clarification and some disclosures because I ran into a lot of trouble when I researched the history of Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan is pretty different compared to my other videos and private research I've done, because they have so many tribes, or they had so many tribes and First Nations that used to inhabit Saskatchewan back in the day, before European settlements came, like the French and the Englishmen and the Spaniards up in the west. And so the problem I ran into is that there were so many tribes with not a lot of historical documentation, because they didn't really have file cabinets back in the day to store all their information in there and then give it to widow old me thousands of years in the future if I could make a small little YouTube video about it. And so I reached out to a lot of these nations' elders that are still alive today, and only one of them replied. And so what I kind of want to tell you is that even through research, someone can still respectfully be wrong. And so if I so happen to give you an inaccurate piece of information, and you were part of those First Nation tribes or part of the tribes, please, 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 please criticize me. Leak my IP address. If I was wrong, please clear it up in the comments, and I will try my best to kind of make an update on that and saying, hey, I was wrong. And so when I talk about these tribes, I will only give you the basics of what that tribe was known for, as well as their first contacts with European settlers, because that is the only thing I know that is facts and truth. Anything outside of that is out of my league. I did reach out, as I mentioned a while back, to one tribe in particular that did end up contacting me back and wanted to speak on the behalf of that nation. And so if they're still up for it, when I talk about them later on in the video, I will include their clip if they give me permission to record the conversation we have and kind of add it to the video, because now it is more better representative, I don't even know how to say it, to that tribe, because you got a native that lives there that knows their history well talking about that tribe. So who am I to say, hey, this guy is wrong? And so hopefully later on in the future he does make an appearance in this video, so stick around for that, please. So like and subscribe, as you will now learn the entire boring history of Saskatchewan. Wait! Before we start the video, this is Frank from the future, by the way. As you can see, I'm recording way far into the video because I forgot to do that annoying thing YouTubers do, where they give that percentage amount of people that aren't subscribed while they show the people that are subscribed. And so I just want you guys to check mine out.
What the hell? Oh my God, no way.
As you can see, it is very pathetic. I mean, 0.01 or 1%, that is absolutely crazy, man. So please subscribe, support my work, and give me $10 million, Mr. Beast. So with that being said, let's continue to the video. All right, so the first indigenous tribe we're going to talk about is the Cree Nation. Now, the Cree Nation is split up into two main groups, and we're kind of just going to talk about the differences between the Plains Cree and the Woodland Cree. The Woodland Cree lived up north in modern day, or today, Saskatchewan. And for those who hadn't seen the Canadian province map, I'll put it up right now. As you can see, the Saskatchewan province is kind of just a big standing up rectangle. And so thank you, shout out to my art teacher, because now I could draw a perfect rectangle, I think. And then up next, you got the Plains Cree, which lived in southern Saskatchewan and obviously its surrounding provinces. And same thing for the Woodland. They didn't just live in Saskatchewan. They lived in its surrounding territories, which is Nunavut and Northwest Territories. And so let's just talk about the main difference between the Plains and the Woodlands. And so the Plains Cree, as you can see, lived a very nomadic lifestyle. And you're probably thinking, Hermie, what did that mean? And well, let me tell you, little Jimmy. It means that they kind of didn't have a direct spot. Like they kind of just moved from place to place, and you will kind of see why in a bit. But yeah, that kind of just means that they were always constantly moving. So they kind of set up camp place to place. They didn't have firm foundations and buildings and all that fancy stuff. And the reason why is because they followed bison. They heavily relied on bison for a lot of things, such as food, clothing, and cultural reasons. And that's kind of the next bullet point. It kind of was part of their economy, quote unquote. They used it a lot for traditional practices, for ceremonies, for burials. It was a huge thing for them, bison. They heavily relied on bison and their migration patterns. And lastly, they were experts in buffalo hunting and bison hunting. They knew the plains like the back of their hands. You throw them in the middle of nowhere and they will know exactly where they are. That's how smart they were. And then up next, you have my homeboys, the Woodland Cree. Now the Woodland were quite the opposite. They lived in forested regions. And so they kind of already had firm foundations and kind of lived in one spot because they had no major reason to kind of migrate. And so they heavily relied on hunting, fishing, and gathering. And they hunted a lot of things. And I will tell you what were some of their famous ones, such as moose, deer, bear, beaver, fish, and they were well known for gathering berries, roots, for making medicine and kind of making soups. And so they heavily relied on their surroundings. And so now that you know the main difference between these two, you kind of learn the difference between their forms of government. Because as crazy as it sounds, they also have their own way of establishing, who's going to be in charge, and the council leaders and the elders, and who were the wise people and who weren't. And so you will see the main difference of what they kind of did. Now, leadership. How were people chosen to lead these two different kinds of Crees? So how would they choose their leaders? You see, back in the day, the Cree people didn't really have an electoral system and a governing body for people to go and vote. And so they kind of did it the respectful and old-fashioned way. And you will see their differences. We'll start with the Plains, who their leader were chosen through kinship, clan, and consensus. Meaning that if this person was well respected among the other tribes in the area and was known by the people to be a good person and was just a well-caring person who cared about the community, then chances are he was going to lead the Plains Cree people. The council, so you had your leader, the chief, and the council. The council was chosen by wisdom, bravery, and ability to lead and decision making. These people knew they were on top of everything, and so they were kind of just known to just be the council leaders. And then you have the Woodland Cree, which their leadership was based on wisdom, experience, and ability to provide. And so, as you can see, kind of two different but yet respectable standards, where they want their leaders to be wise, experienced, and ability to provide, so kind of be prepared through that. And their decision making, I didn't write it here because it was pretty long, but let me just read what I put in my notes. Decisions were made collectively, with elders playing a role in guiding the community through knowledge and spiritual insight. So as you can see, they also did things just a little bit different compared to the Plains, where they kind of just automatically put the elders in that higher role because they are older and the oldest gentlemen and ladies know best. Yay, we're in a different part of a classroom. So before we continue talking about the Cree Nation and the Woodlands and the Plains, we have to talk about Canada itself and how it was formed and how it was founded and all that good, fancy, juicy stuff.
Bruh.
And so, Jacques Cartier, which I know I definitely mispronounced that name one way or another, was the first ever person to, at least European-wise, to go to Canada in 1534. So those are the earliest records of Europeans in Canada. He was a French explorer, and he made first contact. In that same line, on the French side, so French Kingdom, French Parliament, whatever, you have Samuel de Champlain, and he was the one that established the first colony in Quebec City, Quebec, in 1608. And then on the British Empire side, you have Martin Farbellecher. Lord have mercy, they're gonna have my head for this one, I already know it. And so he was the first English European to establish, I guess, a foundation in Canada, or more or less kind of point out like, hey, there's land right there, let's check it out and conquer it because we're British. And so he goes as early as 1576 to 1578, so that's when he was exploring the area. He was looking for a route to go faster into Asia and stumbled across Canada instead. And then you have Henry Hudson. So at the time, he was the explorer that was kind of gaining knowledge of Canada's like ecosystem, nature stuff, British. And so they sent him over to kind of begin establishing a firm foundation of interest. And so with that being said, later on, his last name was used to create the Hudson Bay Company, which was basically chartered by King Charles II of England. And from there on out, they kind of built a bigger establishment there, and they really focused on fur trading. Like that was their main thing. And so now we will talk about the Cree people. So we're gonna go back to indigenous groups and their first ever contact with these European. So they ran into British and French. Man, what a nightmare. All right, now we're going back to the Cree Nation. And so the Cree Nation's first ever contact with Europeans was in 1611. And they became involved in the Hudson Bay Company. As I mentioned, it is a company that mainly focused on the selling and gathering of fur to ship it back to Europe where they could make clothing, blankets, I don't know, whatever. And so the reason why they got involved and why the Hudson Bay Company all of a sudden cared about them was because of knowledge of the area. They had extensive knowledge of obviously bison pattern. They knew how to survive in the wilderness, so they didn't have to put Europeans doing that job. And so it just benefited the Europeans taking advantage of the Cree people. And so in return, they got firearms, metal tools, and alcohol. That literally sounds like your American dad that likes to shop at Home Depot. So they were given a lot of this, and because, as you will see, because of European contact, almost every single tribe in Saskatchewan faced exposure to disease and increasingly decreased the population of the indigenous people, including the Plains Cree. So the Plains Cree took a big hit with their population when Europeans started to show up due to disease. On the other hand, though, you have the Woodland. The Woodland made first contact with the Europeans in 17th century, which was around the same year, 1611, 1620. And so they also became heavily involved in the Hudson Bay Company because of the knowledge of northern Saskatchewan and its surrounding territories, because they lived there. And so they also took advantage of it by asking these people to go kind of gather the fur for them. And because of that, they traded a lot of beaver fur. And in return, they got metal tools, firearms, and blankets. And so they were given pretty good stuff, one lie. But there is a big con. Because of their involvement in the Hudson Bay Company, three things hit the Woodland people so hard that they also had a huge decrease in population. And that was overhunting animals such as beaver, because they mainly traded for beaver, and diseases, and they became reliant on trading. So much so that it caused them to overhunt beaver in that area, and also moose and other animals. And so you can see here that things are starting to shift in what was a very established foundation and life with these Cree people to now kind of being shifted towards something more different, being shaped into something more ugly, unfortunately. And you will see that with every single indigenous group that we will talk about. But with that being said, we have now finished the basic history of the Cree Nation, one of just a couple of the Saskatchewan tribes we will be talking about. The next tribe we have, I was going to have an elder chief talk there, as I mentioned, but they ended up canceling the interview, and so I will no longer be putting them on the screen because I got nothing. And so I just want to apologize for that, and so I will also be very careful when it comes to talking about the history, and I won't talk about things that are in documentation and not about things that aren't. So with that being said, let's talk about the Asini Bonini. I butchered that name, and I'm not going to edit that out. No, sir. The word is supposed to be together, but I split it up because there's like this line right here for some reason. And so yeah, the word is together. So it's not two words, it's one. But yeah, the Asini Bonini split it from the Swigs in 1640. The Swigs are known to us as the Dakota tribes. And so if you're American, obviously you know South and North Dakota. And so that name originated from the indigenous groups Swigs. And so they separated from the Swigs in 1640 and headed westward to the northern plains. And so they were basically in South Saskatchewan. They lived in the Saskatchewan rivers, in Lake Winnipeg, and in modern day Minnesota. And so they were near those areas, and so that's kind of just the basic history of that. And so now let's talk about how their government worked. All right, now let's talk about the Asibonini government. I hate saying that name because I am 100% saying it wrong. And so now let's talk about how their government worked. You have basically two things that made up the government, the council and the chiefs. And for the council side, it was mostly made up by elders, because elders, once again, just play a natural huge role in indigenous groups altogether, from what I'm able to pick up. And they made collective decisions, such as, hey, should we go attack the British, or should we attack the French, or should we make peace with them, or should we deport them to Afghanistan? Who knows? So they just made collective decisions, and if they weren't elders in the councils, they were chosen based on wisdom and ability to lead, because those two are very important that I wish modern politicians had. At least the big ones, not the small town ones that I've interviewed. I love those guys. Now, as for chiefs, there were several chiefs, at least for the Asibonini. You had like the war chief, who was like, war. And then you had the peace chief that was like, peace. And you had the spiritual chief that was like, spirits. And so there were kind of just separate roles, I guess like departments to say. And they were chosen based on bravery and leadership qualities. So basically the community liked them, census decisions. And so with that being said, we're going to have their government checked off. So now let's talk about first European contact with the Asiboninis. All right, first contact with the Europeans. How did it go for the Asiboninis?
So what the hell?
All right, so they traded with French and Englishmen. So they didn't just pick a side. And in return, they received firearms, gunflame, ammunition, jewelry, knives.
Oh my God.
Pigment brasses kept, wool blankets, metal implants, and iron projectile points, whatever that is. And so, with that being said, I feel like they got spoiled out of all the other native tribes. I mean, they got a lot of stuff. I wonder what cursed they got, because the Cree people got a bunch of disease and over hunting, and then they begin to lose, I guess, their natural way of life when the Europeans showed up and grief started to take place. But as you could see, I don't have any bullet point here for like their flaw. So I think they made it out of the hood just fine. Psych! Nope, they actually got their own thing that was big enough that I couldn't write here. And so they had the smallpox tragedy. In 1836, a American fur company steamboat, St. Peter's, arrived at Fort Union carrying smallpox, killing 10,000 natives. So, yeah, notice how everything is slowly becoming diseases. Oh, wow, wow, wow. But with the next tribe we're going to talk about, they actually got it a lot worse because they started a whole war with the Americans and partially Canadians, and a lot of them were killed. So, yay! So let's talk about that next. All right, we're back in a different classroom. So let's talk about the Dakota/Swiss history, because a while back I did mention that the Swiss and Dakota are the same thing but just different names. And so let's talk about where they come from originally. So they used to inhabit southern Saskatchewan, Alberta, South Dakota, North Dakota, and so as you can see that the Dakota were kind of also spread around the southern Canada and northern US. And now let's just talk about their lifestyle and how they operated. So the Dakota were also semi-nomadic, just like the Cree people, because as you can see, they kind of shared the similar land, and so they just shared similar lifestyles because they also lived in the plains and also relied on bison. So bison also played a huge part of their economy, such as making clothes, food, and traditional practices and materials for their homes called teepees. And so Dakota are kind of similar to Cree, at least in the sense of lifestyle. But now let's go to their form of government, because theirs are actually a little bit more different. All right, now let's talk about the Dakota/Swiss government. So honestly, this one was my favorite to research because of how easily split up they were when I was researching them. So it felt like everything was just given to me in a golden platter. And so I even organized it very pretty here. And so let's talk about chiefs. So these chiefs were also split into separate groups. And so the chiefs were chosen through wisdom, bravery, and leadership. And so just like I mentioned, like other tribes have war chiefs and peace chiefs and traditional chiefs, they also had similar roles. And so this is how they were chosen. And the councils were chosen mainly for organizing war or organizing alliances, and to make sure that the people weren't over hunting. So they also controlled the way people hunted, and tribal movements. So just like I mentioned, the Dakota were semi-nomadic, and as we established, that basically means they move place to place and follow migrations. And so when it came time to make those decisions on whether or not they were going to continue moving or stay put, the council was the one that made these decisions collectively, of course, with all the community. And also, they were chosen through wisdom, bravery, and leadership. Just like the elders were their own separate roles. And what I really like about this one is that it feels like, at least for this one, they have a lot more important roles. And I'm not like disrespecting the other elders from other tribes. I just like how more organized this one is. Like I mentioned, like this information was given to me basically on a golden platter, and I love them for it. And so they focused a lot on traditions. To keep tradition alive, the elders will hold the ceremonies and will teach the kids stories or pass down stories. And then they also controlled law. And so they were very tied with law. So if an elder said, hey, you can't jaywalk or you will be deployed in Iraq in 2003, then that will become the law if it's collectively made by the elders. And then you have tribal warfare. So during war, the elders get to kind of play a role in how they want to lead warfare. If they want to do this strategy or that strategy. And their advice was highly respected. So meaning that if war was going on, that the council decides that they want to have war, and the elders were playing a part in that tribal warfare, they can give advice to the council, basically saying, hey, maybe we should not do war because war kills people, last time I checked. And so the council can collectively agree to stop a war and which the chief will execute. And so, like I said, I really love their former government. It is just well organized compared to the others that I was researching. And so now that we did their government, let's talk about when the Europeans get involved. And that's when things get really messy, really fast. And I am very sorry for the things I'm about to say because honestly, this history kind of sucks. Oh boy. All right, so let's talk about Europeans and the Dakotas, also known as the Swiss. So they also came in contact with them during the 1600s. So a lot of these tribes came in contact around the year they started building settlements and showing up. And they traded with the AFC, the American Fur Company. From what I can research, they did little to no trading with the Hudson Bay Company like all the other tribes. However, they did also trade with the Frenchmen and the Englishmen, and later on the Americans. And in return, with fur, like I said, fur is just a big thing for some reason. They wanted firearms, ammunition, kettles, and blankets, which they got. And their biggest flaw, well, not their biggest, we're going to talk about that in a bit, but they got some flaws, such as diseases. A lot of Dakotas started dying due to disease, displacement. So like I said, they used to live in what is now Minnesota! And so they were displaced out of Minnesota, and we will talk about it in a bit as to why, and also Iowa. And they also had COR, competition over resource. Because just like we mentioned before, they lived in southern Saskatchewan where the Cree people were. And the Cree people were looking for fur for the HBC, Hudson Bay Company. And the Dakota were looking for fur for the AFC, the American Fur Company. So you kind of see where the problem begins, especially during overhunting and animals become scarce. Oh no. In fact, it becomes such a mess that we will now do an entire section of the Dakota War. And yeah, buckle for that one. It's going to be a fun story. I could show you that much. Before we talk about the Dakota War, let me give you the backstory. And so the backstory starts in 1862. So what caused the Dakota War? What would lead the Dakota to go and start attacking settlers and tribes? And so here are the main 4 reasons as to why I believe the Dakota War started. However, a lot of people believe different things, and so let me just share you my perspective. And so let's start with conflicts with Europeans. So, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of different fur trading companies, mainly HBC and the American Fur Company. And so that led to a lot of conflict because these Europeans wanted a lot of fur, the Dakota didn't get a lot in return, and a lot of broken promises were made. Europeans started attacking the Dakotas and their tents and their camps, and so that was a huge issue. And so a while back, they ended up signing a couple of treaties, basically saying, hey, leave us alone, and then we'll give you your fur. And so they were kind of working things out. Conflict with tribes. That is another big one, because as I mentioned, a lot of indigenous groups hopped on that bandwagon to basically just start grabbing a bunch of fur, because in return they received a bunch of new technology they never seen, like guns. And who doesn't love guns? And so a lot of conflicts began to arise, specifically with the Cree and the Dakota, because they both lived in the same areas and they both needed that fur, and they both were crossing each other's territories. And so, as I mentioned, the elders and the councils were kind of in charge of making the war decisions and deciding how they're going to go around these situations. Normally, talking kind of just got the problem solved with the elders giving their advice, but because of so much tension going on between the two and the companies, chiefs kind of start ignoring that advice. Especially, we're going to talk about in a little bit, Chief Little Crow. And so, now let's talk about my other favorite one, Manifest Destiny. God's will to go westward. And so Americans were starting to go westward. And where the Dakota? Well, they were kind of middle west, like South and North Dakota, like modern state-wise, and Minnesota and Saskatchewan, but that's Canadian territory. Manifest Destiny. So they start pushing more to the west, and they start kicking out the Dakota people, which leads to loss of land. The Dakota are starting to lose their original homes and their lands and everything that's around them. They start getting separated, forcefully removed, or their land is sold for very cheap because the natives honestly don't have that experience of signing contracts and making deals, and so they easily fell for like a cheap deal, like getting their land stolen for like 3 pickles and a double cheeseburger from McDonald's. All right, now let's talk about the Dakota War. And during this section of the video, I will not be making any jokes whatsoever. Normally, I like to consider myself a little jokester, but this part is a piece of history not many people talk about, and I want to take this part of the video very seriously. So I'm just going to tone it down a bit, and we're going to talk about the 1862 Dakota War, led by Chief Little Crow. Now, Chief Little Crow was very tired of all the things that the U.S. government and companies has done to his people, and so one day he led a uprising in Minnesota, specifically on August 17, during which he started war with the Plains Cree, the Assiniboines, and the U.S. government. So the U.S. government, being the U.S. government, obviously wasn't going to let it slide. They started to heavily fight back, and long story short, they ended up beating the Dakota people pretty bad. So much so that they captured a lot of Dakotas and put them in Fort Snelling. Now, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right or wrong, and so I will just display the name and you could figure that out for yourself. But Fort Snelling had around, they just had a lot of Dakota people there. And it was a camp where they held all these people, and during the winter, when the winter started to roll around, 130 to 300 Dakotas died due to measles and harsh conditions. Now, I'm seeing a big thing when I was researching this, that they called this place a concentration camp. And I personally want to clear the air, and once again, this is my opinion. You don't have to hear it, you don't have to care about it, but I kind of want to give you my slice of the pie. I don't know how the saying goes. But personally, I don't think this was a concentration camp, because a concentration camp, by definition, is a place to put prisoners of war or political enemies and actively killing them. And so I don't think this was a concentration camp, because the U.S. government wasn't actively killing the Dakota people. However, they did not provide them with the right equipment to survive the winter in this prison, because it was harsh conditions. As a lot of Minnesotans may know, winter there is pretty tough. I've been to Minnesota during the winter, and I don't know if I'll be able to survive in a camp with nothing but what I have on. And not to mention, but disease was also spreading through the camp, and the U.S. government did nothing to help the Dakota people, and therefore they just died, you know. And so I also want to talk about the executions that happened on December 26, 1862 in Makota, I think is how you say it, in Makota, which is a city in Minnesota. Now, fun fact, I personally been to Makota, the city of Makota, in which these Dakota people were hanged and killed. And I visited their memorial and I paid respect, because this was a tragic event that took place in that city. And long story short, all the Dakota people that were captured were executed right there. It was an estimate of 26 to 30. And so they displayed their names right now, like in modern times, not back then. They display their names now on a weird looking piece of paper. I'm not sure what it's called. And to kind of show remembrance to the Dakota who were just fighting for their land. So it is a really tough topic, I suppose you could say. And Chief Little Crow, now let's talk about him. Let me switch to my PowerPoints because I got notes here. And so let's talk about Chief Little Crow, the man who led it all. And I will give you the long story short kind of thing, because obviously this video is based on Saskatchewan and not about the Dakota War. And so I am really dumbing down and summarizing this entire thing. I personally encourage you to research the Dakota War and everything that happened because it's pretty jacked up. So on July 3rd, 1863, Chief Little Crow was shot by a man and his son. So Chief Little Crow, doing the best he could, also pulled out his weapon and fired at the man, but it only hit his ear. Like, it didn't really do any damage, while the man shot him in the chest, killing him. And what they did is that they brought his body to Hutchinson and displayed it right there in the crowd for people to make fun of it, beat it up, do a lot of things to his body. And the man's son ended up scalping Little Crow's hair/head and was paid for it. So the U.S. government ended up paying the man $500 and the son $75 for killing Little Crow. And so with that being said, we are done with talking about the Dakota history. And now let's talk about the Dini/Dean history. They're the second to last tribe we got to talk about before now talking about Saskatchewan and how it came to be. I also want to mention that not every single Dakota that was captured was killed. They were just forcefully, after the war, moved out of their land, such as future state Nebraska, South Dakota, and Canada, Saskatchewan. So that's why I want to talk about the Dakota War, because that led to some Dakotas branching out to Saskatchewan. Now let's talk about the Dini tribe, second to last of the tribes that used to inhabit Saskatchewan, at least the major ones. And so we got the Dinis, and so they used to live kind of northern Canada, and we got Northwest Territories, Yukon, Alaska, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. So they kind of did inhabit a huge chunk of what is now Canada, and they also were semi-nomadic, meaning they also kind of moved place to place, and they mainly relied on hunting, fishing, gathering, and for animals that they hunted is caribou, moose, and fish. And then they also heavily relied on seasonal movements. That's kind of what their economy was tied to. So yeah, they just kind of moved a lot. And I feel like a broken record, because I feel like every time I talk about the tribes, I'm basically saying the same things. However, it is still important to talk about each indigenous tribe and their forms, because, you know, even though some of them may look the same, they are somewhat completely different. Now let's talk about the Dini government, which I couldn't find too much about, and so I try to dumb it down as I possibly can. And so from what I'm able to gather, they were organized in bands and clans led by elders/chiefs. Because the Dini were so big, like spread across nearly a lot of territories and provinces, at least in today's time, you know, back in the day there weren't really territories or provinces, it was just land. But because they were so widely spread, they were often split up into a lot of smaller groups. And the decisions were made collectively as a whole. And they had a rich spiritual life with beliefs centered around nature and environment. And so they respected a lot the nature around them and as well as the environment. And they just played a small role in, I guess, taking care of what's around them. All right, now let's talk about European contact with the Dinis. And so, just like everyone else, they got their first contacts during the 1600s, during the fur trade. And they worked alongside the HBC, Hudson Bay Company, and the NWC, Northwest Company. And in return for them giving them a lot of fur, they got mainly firearms, tools, metal cooking utensils. As for their flaws, I didn't really write down a lot, anything here, because their list is actually pretty big, and so I'll just read it off my notes. Flaws included dependency on goods, economic disruption, disease, conflict, violence, cultural disruption, land and resource exploitation, and overhunting. And so they also had their huge fair share of flaws when it came to working alongside the fur companies. And so with that being said, that is one more tribe we could now check off. And the last one is the Saltex, if I am saying that right. I will let you be the judge of that, Saltex. But yeah, that is going to be the last one. And after we talk about that one, we will now be talking about Saskatchewan itself as a province, because keep in mind, Saskatchewan has not existed yet. All of this is pre-Saskatchewan and kind of pre-Canada. So yeah, so this from a long time ago, and so I'm basically just dumbing down 400 to 500 years of history in bullet points, just because if I talk about the entire thing, we're gonna be here until the sun blows up. All right, now let's talk about the Saltex tribe's history. And we're also gonna keep it short and simple, because researching theirs was also a little bit harder than usual. And so they used to inhabit the areas of Lake Superior and Lake Michigan. And so as you can see, they were not really necessarily big like the Dinis. They were kind of just within the waters areas. And as you can see, they were also semi-nomadic. Living in the lakes made it kind of easy to stay put, because they heavily relied on fishing, hunting, and berry gathering. However, they were seasonal migrations that they will take time to time, mainly during the winter or spring or summers. And that's where Saskatchewan and Manitoba come in. So they used to migrate between those two provinces in modern times, at least. Remember that these provinces don't exist just yet, but they used to remain in those lands that would later become Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and of course Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota. But with that being said, I feel like we got the basic of that. Now let's talk about their government, which I will do right here, because writing a lot on the whiteboard is kind of annoying. It takes a couple of minutes, and also I don't know if anyone really cares that I write on the whiteboard. And if you made it this far in the video, which I highly doubt anyone has, then let me know if you want me to continue writing on whiteboards, or put Minecraft gameplay in the background, or Subway Surfer gameplay. And also if you like the jokes I've been making, or if you consider that hurtful or offensive. So with that being said, let's talk about their form of government. I will be going through my notes here. They were organized as well by bands or clans, each band consisting of extended family group. Leadership was chosen through merit and consensus, while elders played a crucial role in decision making and maintaining crucial traditions. And so, as you can see, elders in this tribe, at least, I kind of give them that role where they have to continue preserving their traditions and passing down stories and all that fun stuff. And so we'll also talk about the contact of Europeans, since I'm on a roll and I haven't had to make any cuts yet, because I sometimes get off track and I have to cut certain parts of the video or make a joke that's too inappropriate for YouTube. And so let's talk about contact with Europeans. Same thing, 17th century or 1600s for short. They were also involved in the fur trade, and they were introduced to the trading opportunities where they got firearms and metal tools mainly. The big flaw they had were that their involvement altered traditional economy and social structure and introduced diseases. And I want to kind of dive a little bit deep into that, because as you can see, their economy was mainly seasonal migration. where they'll just go place to place. But because Europeans started telling them, hey, we need fur, they kind of just stayed put in certain spots where they knew a lot of animals with that good fur used to be at. And so that also led to overhunting, like most of these tribes did during the fur trading pandemic, if you want to call it that. And so with that being said, we finally finished talking about at least the big indigenous tribes that used to inhabit Saskatchewan and its nearby provinces. Keep in mind though that there's probably a lot more that I don't even know exist, and let alone know the history. And so kind of just understand that just because I'm going to stop with indigenous tribes here, it doesn't mean I've talked about every single tribe known to mankind that's ever stepped foot in Saskatchewan. But it gives you a good idea of just how many of the big tribes used to roam and how their life was gradually changed once Europeans arrived. And so with that being said, we now get to talk about how Saskatchewan was formed. So what led to Saskatchewan finally being a province? And so we will be talking about Frederick Wag Halton. But before we do that, we need to talk about the Dominion Land Act of 1872. So stick around for that, please, if there's like a single soul watching this far in. All right, now that we talked about the entire tribes of Saskatchewan, or at least a majority of the tribes, now let's talk about the early exploration now involving Europeans. So I know I mentioned basically this entire video of the fur trading era and Europeans trading with the indigenous tribes. So let's kind of tone it back and just talk about the fur trading era and how Europeans contacted the indigenous groups. And so the first one to ever go directly to the territory of Saskatchewan, European-wise, was Henry Kelsey. He was an employer from the Hudson Bay Company who was sent out to that area to establish a more connections with the indigenous groups, such as the Cree, Assiniboines, and the Dakotas, as we talked earlier about. And during the 18th and 19th century, the fur trade was at its absolute peak. During the 1600s, you had trading here and there and whatnot. And during these 2 centuries, that's when the fur trading kind of boomed. It was at its highest with Northwest Company, the fur trading, and Hudson Bay Company, and later the American Fur Company. And so a lot of the companies now started to get involved during this time. And also I do want to mention 2 little side note things, because I know I didn't really talk about Canada as a country, but I just want to add that. July 1st, 1867, Canada became officially a country. And before we even talk about Saskatchewan, I got to tell you about what Saskatchewan was before it became a province, because it was part of the Northwest Territories. In 1870, Hudson Bay Company sold all their territory that they have to Canada in 1870, making Northwest Territory the official territory of Canada. And you'll see from there how later in the future, a idea is proposed known as the Buffalo Territory, where they kind of wanted to put Saskatchewan and Manitoba together and call it the Buffalo Province. But however, things didn't really go as planned, and it ended up becoming Saskatchewan and Manitoba. So now let's talk about how that came to be. All right, picture this: Canada, fresh country, fresh out of the box, and Northwest Territories, a newly made territory with no European settlers. And so Canada kind of needs to act fast in order to start populating that area, because it is empty of Europeans, of course. Indigenous, that's another story, but now we're talking about Europeans, and it is empty of Europeans. And so Canada passes the Dominion Land Act of 1872. It was passed in April 14, 1872. And it encouraged settlers to move into Northwest Territories, including Saskatchewan, because remember, Saskatchewan doesn't exist yet. It was before Saskatchewan. And so the government basically offered 160 acres for a very small fee. So Europeans would pay a small fee to the government, and then they could choose 160 acres of their choosing in the entire territory of Northwest. And this led to a huge increase of Europeans and Americans. That's right, even Americans started leaving the US and going to Canada and paying their small fee and living in Canada. And as you can see, the Dominion Land Act really kind of started booming all of this. And so much so that a lot of people before the act even passed got word of the alleged act at the time that was going to be passed. And so a lot of Europeans already started making their way to Canada. And so one of these people we're going to talk about is Frederick Wag Houghton and his family. He is responsible for Saskatchewan and Manitoba. And so we will now talk about his life and how he encouraged the government to finally split apart Northwest because it was a little too big for my liking. Before we talk about Mr. Houghton, I do want to mention the railroad expansion of 1880s. So during the 1880s, Canada started now expanding, at least in the sense of how transportation and people are going to get around. And one of those was the railways. And so they ended up building a lot of railways, mainly in Quebec, to now the new Northwest Territory that they've gained. And so a lot of connections were finally made to go to Saskatchewan, and that also led to a huge increase in Europeans. So yeah, I just wanted to mention the Canadian Pacific Railway, also known as CPR. And so with that being said, now that that's out of the way, now let's talk about Mr. Houghton. All right, now let's talk about the great life of Frederick Wag, W-A-G, Houghton. He was the first ever primer of Northwest Territories and responsible for the idea of the Buffalo Province, which was later turned into Alberta and Saskatchewan. I don't know why in the past I kept saying Manitoba when Manitoba was already a province, or at least a named territory. So Goofy Goober in the past messed up. So I just want to clear the air. It's Alberta and Saskatchewan, not Saskatchewan and Manitoba. With that being said, let's talk about the life of Frederick Houghton. He was born in Woolwich, England on the 25th of November, 1857. And during that time, his family later on, in just a couple of years, moved to Peterborough, Ontario. And in 1860, they immigrated in 1860, and then later went to Montreal, Quebec. And the young life of Houghton isn't really that well documented. However, we did know that he studied a little bit in Toronto and eventually studied law in Usgood. I know the people are going to have my head for that. Usgood Hall in 1882. And he dedicated a lot of his life to politics and law. So, as I mentioned, he begins to study law, and in 1884, he begins to put his experience and what he learned to the test by opening his first law practice firm in Fort Macleod, Alberta, or at the time, Northwest Territories. So as you can see, he ends up moving a little bit to the west because that's just his calling, I suppose. And later on, he takes it a step further by running for part of the Legislative Assembly of Northwest Territory in September 5 and won, defeating Charles Conybeare in 1887. And for the next 5 elections after this one, he won consecutively. So in total, he served in the Legislative Assembly of Northwest Territories for a total of 6 times. Real quick, before I start yapping about all of this, I kind of want to give you a little fun fact once again. I've been to the capital of Northwest Territory, Yellowknife, a couple years back, and I gotta tell you, man, I loved it. I love Northwest Territories. I will never diss Northwest Territories because I love it so much. So much beautiful nature, so much beautiful tribes and culture, and I will highly recommend the Great Slave Cod. I ate that and it changed my life forever. Now, let's continue talking about Mr. Houghton, or should I say Sir Houghton. He became the first Premier of Northwest Territories in October 7, 1897. And during his time in office, he realized, you know what, Northwest Territories is a little too big for me to govern. So I need to find a way to kind of just cut this territory some slack. It is too big and we need to do something about it. And so he proposed to the 7th Prime Minister at the time, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, that how about we cut Northwest Territories in half, 50% off, he said, and call it the Buffalo Territory. So you have Northwest Territory that was up in the Northwest, and then you had Buffalo that was south of the Northwest Territories. So cut in half, Northwest on top, Buffalo on the bottom. But the 7th Prime Minister at the time, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, said, no, it is too big. Like my brother in Christ, have you seen Ontario and Quebec and British Columbia? They're all hella big, so what the hell? So he said no, and he decided a better idea. Hey, how about we cut again your proposed province? So you have Northwest Territories. How about we cut it in half and then cut it in half? And so once you cut Northwest Territories into half of the half, now he decided Alberta and Saskatchewan were going to be created. And so in 1905, he approved it, and now they officially became provinces. Yippee! Celebrate, celebrate. Because now we have Saskatchewan. Now we have the two capitals, Alberta being Edmonton, and then Saskatchewan being Regina or Regina. I personally don't like using the capital name Regina, rather saying Regina, because Regina sounds a little too close to vagina. So now that Alberta and Saskatchewan are officially provinces, let's talk about how they got their name. Alberta came from Queen Victoria's 4th daughter, Princess Louise Carolina Alberta, while Saskatchewan is a little more complicated, but it involves the Cree people. So that's why you gotta know your history, children. It came from the Saskatchewan River, but how the natives used to say it. So I'm gonna pull it up on the computer, because it turns out I even miswrote the full name of how they used to say it. Because, oh my lord, how do you even say that, dude? I don't know if you guys could see it, but there is, I mean, I'll pay you $5 if you could say that 5 times without stuttering. But with that being said, we got their provinces now. So now we're gonna talk about Walter Scott. Walter Scott was the first Premier of Saskatchewan. And also, I know no one's watching this and I'm just talking to myself. And so I am going to give you a little secret. Next video idea has, well, not idea, it's been confirmed to be about Manitoba, about Winnipeg, the capital. And so I'll be going to Manitoba in November 1st to hopefully also interview a local politician. And at the end of this video, hopefully, if they don't cancel, I will also be interviewing a local politician from Regina. And so I hope you guys stick around for that. Please like and subscribe, please. So to close off Halton's chapter for good, let's talk about the last few things he did in his career, at least major-wise, before ultimately passing away and leaving his legacy on Canada for the rest of their history. In 1916, he was knighted and became Chancellor of the University of Saskatchewan for a bit. The next year, he became Chief Justice of Saskatchewan in Regina and was officially retired from any form of politics or that fancy stuff in 1938. And lastly, in 1942, in the peak of World War II, died in Montreal, Quebec. It seems that he decided to retire back in his hometown where his family originated or immigrated originally, and decided to carry on and leave Canada to continue its glory without him. So yeah, hats off to Mr. Halton. Because of him, we got Saskatchewan and Alberta. A lot of people give credit to the 7th Premier, but I give it to him because he was the one that fought to make sure that those provinces ended up becoming what he wanted them to be. Even though they didn't become the Buffalo province like how he wanted it to, but it became something better, something more unique, Alberta and Saskatchewan. So thank you, Mr. Houghton. Now let's talk about Walter Scott, first primer of Saskatchewan.
Alright guys, it's been another day, and as you can see, I got myself a itty bitty tiny mic, and I will be testing it out during this part of the video, and while editing, I will decide if it is absolutely garbage and if I should throw it away, or if it's so good that I will cherish it for the rest of my life. And so I'm just record this part with this mic, just to test it out. Anywho, let's talk about Thomas Walter Scott. Now, he is the first primer of Saskatchewan.
Oh, hell no, that mic was absolutely ass. I am sincerely sorry for making you listen to that. So I will just go back to screaming at the camera like a maniac. So, Thomas Walter Scott. Yes, first primer or premier of Saskatchewan. He was born in 1867 in London Township, Ontario. And throughout his teenage life, he moved to Portage la Prairie, Manitoba in 1885, and just 1 year later moved to the capital of Northwest Territories, Regina. So, as you can see, he is heavily inspired by Regina, and as well as later on in the future when he does eventually become primer or premier, he ends up choosing Regina as the capital of Saskatchewan. And so we will talk now about what he did for work. As I mentioned before, Mr. Houghton, he worked at a law firm, and he worked a little bit with law, politics, before eventually becoming the premier of Northwest Territories. And so let's talk about what he did for work before getting involved in politics. All right, now let's talk about his line of work. So he worked a pretty interesting job since he's going to be entering politics. And so I will get my tinfoil hat after we finish Walter Scott's section, and I will give you my personal opinion on how he became primer of Saskatchewan, because it's pretty sketchy. So he worked and owned newspapers in Regina. So he used to edit, publish, and work alongside newspaper agencies around Regina. And even later on, opened Moose Jaw Times, and later bought the Regina Leader. And that one is actually still used in today's time in Regina, called Regina Leader Post. And that was from 1895 to 1900. And I also wanted to mention that in his community, they were hosting baseball teams, or they had a baseball team, and he was the pitcher for that baseball team. So it was pretty random, and part of the only cool things I found about him, fun fact-wise. So yeah, he was a baseball pitcher. But with that being said, now let's talk about his involvement directly in politics. And you will see, it gets pretty sketchy. I got my eyes on you, Mr. Scott. Real quick, before we keep moving, I should mention all the newspaper agencies that he owned and ran and edited were heavily tied to his politics, which was the Liberal Party of Canada. And so everything that he published was clearly aligned to his beliefs. And so a lot of people claim that he was being very biased during his work. However, that is an opinion I'll leave to the people and not to me. Politics, because everything has to be politics. So let's talk about Mr. Scott's involvement in politics. So in 1900, he ran for the federal riding of Assiniboia West, and was elected, and was also elected in the House of Commons, which is basically a group of people that make decisions, not too complicated. That's why they're called common folks. So during the whole controversy of, I guess, the Buffalo province, so as I mentioned, it was that one ginormous province that was supposed to just be one, but it got split up into Alberta and Saskatchewan. So during this whole entire time, Mr. Scott actually supported Houghton's idea of, hey, maybe we should have one big province, cut Northwest Territories in half. But then, politics. You see, the seventh Prime Minister at the time, who, as we established, was Sir Laurier. He was part of the Liberal government, and this is not me like being oh, you liberals wanna, I don't know, be sent to Afghanistan or something. I'm just giving you the facts here. So because Laurier was part of the Liberal government, he quickly ended up changing his mind and converted to the two-province idea, because Mr. Holton was not part of the Liberal Party, and so it didn't make sense for Mr. Scott to align to that belief, because as we will see in a bit, him siding with Laurier ended up benefiting him way more than it should have. But yeah, with that being said, I want to talk about his little background in politics, mainly these two, and then these were kind of established to be opinions. The next thing we're going to talk about is kind of the behind the scenes of how Saskatchewan, Alberta became provinces, but with Mr. Scott included. Yay! Politics. So let's talk once again about behind the scenes of how Saskatchewan and Alberta were created, but now with Mr. Scott involved. Yippee! The collab we all asked for. So on February 1905, the federal government of Canada decides, hey, you know what? Let's ignore Mr. Holton's idea and let's just create Alberta and Saskatchewan. But let's try to make it on July 1st, which was the Independence Day of Canada, to kind of hold more meaning in 1905. And so they already had the bill ready. It was all ready to sign. But the Premier, Holton, says, no, stop it, mister, because he wants the Buffalo province, and also because you are signing this bill to split up two provinces, you're also going to be splitting up all the schools that so happen to be in what should be the middle line of the new province borders. And most of these schools that were within these territories were faith-based schools. So he also fought to support these Catholic schools and Christian schools and just schools in general that were going to be divided because of the two different provinces. And so Saskatchewan receives royal assent on July 20th. Basically, what royal assent is, let's say there are two bills. You have, for example, Mr. Halton's, the province one, and you have the federal government of Canada, which is two province. The royal assent basically means that a monarch at the time, for example, the Queen Victoria, she could say, hey, I am lining up with the legislation of Canada, so sign that one. Basically, she's giving her heavy opinion. And because long live the Queen, they ended up immediately signing the bill to make Alberta and Saskatchewan. And in September 1st, 1905, it officially becomes the provinces. You got Alberta and Saskatchewan. But now we have to talk about the election process, because now you have a fresh government of Saskatchewan. We're not going to talk about Alberta. Maybe if I ever make my way over there. I mean, I've done it in the past, but if I go again, then yeah, I will talk about Alberta and their elections and whatnot. But we're only going to focus on Saskatchewan. So their elections, I mean, you must guess it must have been pretty hard. I mean, a new province had been formed. You got to create legislation, government, lieutenants, governors, and a premier. So how are they going to do it? What the sigma? And also, I keep noticing that I keep saying primer and premier, but I just learned recently that the official way to say it is premier. And so I keep messing up because it doesn't sound right. So I may say primer sometimes, but I just mean premier. I'm just done. Politics.
What the hell?
Oh, I missed. All right, let's talk about the elections. So we got two people that won it, Scott and Halton. But Halton is fresh out of the box, no longer a premier. He was premier from 1897 to 1905, and as we established, Saskatchewan is from 1905, and so he is free, he is single. And then you got Mr. Scott, and so their political parties was liberal, and he was for the provincial rights. So he believed in backing up the rights against provinces, protecting them from the federal government, while Mr. Scott was liberal, whatever that means in Canada. Because I'll be honest with you, I don't know that. I just know that. So Anywho, let's talk about how the elections went. Technically speaking too, Halton wasn't part of the first ever election of Saskatchewan, which is what I find sketchy, because I'll even read it from the notes, the official records of Canada that I just made notes of. August 16, 1905, the Liberal Party of Saskatchewan led a leadership convention. Scott was the lone candidate. So technically speaking, Halton is not even part of it. He just wrote his name on the ballot. With that being said, still pretty close to a guy who didn't even try to win. He got 52.25%, while he got 47.47%. Now, you might be thinking, what's a sigma? It doesn't add to 100%. You're right. There is 0.28% missing. Now, before you say, oh no, they rigged the elections, go riot the capital at Ottawa. No. I have no idea where those 0.28% went. Straight up, I tried looking all over the place for it. I have no idea. I don't know if it went to the seats, or if it went to Parliament, or if it got taxed by the British. No idea. But either way, even if Mr. Halton got that 28%, it still wouldn't have made any difference. Scott won. So, with that being said, Mr. Scott is made primer, or premier. I don't know why I keep saying primer. It's bugging me now. On September 12, 1905, and he served all the way to 1916. But before we talk about that, let's talk about how he was appointed. Like I said, this whole entire thing was a bit sketchy, but I'm gonna be honest with you, it's 3 in the morning and I had like 6 Red Bulls, and I'm not an energy drinker guy, and so I am genuinely tweaking right now. So I'm just gonna read off the notes because my hands are starting to shake a little while I was writing on the board. So the bullet points that I wrote is, after the Saskatchewan Act passed, the government needed to be set up. Frederick Halton was a potential candidate for Saskatchewan's first premier or lieutenant governor. Due to Halton's opposition to dividing the territories and saw his stance on resources and Catholic schools, the federal government mistrusted him. So Prime Minister Laurier appointed Amedee E. Forget as Saskatchewan's first lieutenant governor. Amedee E. Forget made Walter Scott premier, but a lot of people suspected that the primer at the time, Laurier, had a lot of influence, if you know what I mean, to get Mr. Scott in power to premier. So with that being said, a controversy was made in Ottawa and Saskatchewan. Basically, the parliaments and those in the legislation started complaining, basically saying either this guy during a legitimate election still get appointed as premier. Though going by, so assuming that the elections weren't rigged, which I'm going to sue them because I believe Canada actually cares about their elections. I know a lot of people are going to have my head for that. But assuming it wasn't rigged, then either way, Mr. Scott won the elections and there's no denying it. So with that being said, Scott was sworn in as premier on September 12th, and he was premier from 1905 to 1916. And so this is the second to last big thing we're going to talk about. So Saskatchewan finally has their primer. Yippee, celebrate, I'm tweaking. So now let's talk about the Great Depression in just a few years from there, 15 years. During the 1930s, World War I just ended and people are celebrating, yippee, celebrate, and then the Great Depression in Canada hits. And so we are going to talk about how Saskatchewan dealt with it, because Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba specifically were hit the hardest. All right, the Great Depression. So let's talk about that and how Saskatchewan dealt with it. Saskatchewan was hit the worst during the Great Depression, according to the Royal Commission, but we will get to that in a bit. So let's talk about how it mainly affected Saskatchewan, and that was through agriculture. For the 3 little Jimmies watching this video that don't know what agriculture means, it is basically the economy tied to crops and tied to harvest and food. So if food falls, prices raise for food, prices in general has to be raised for people to afford it, and therefore the economy kind of shakes a little. So it doesn't it plays a pretty important role, not just in Canada's history, but like just world history in general. Why do you think groceries here in the US have been skyrocketing? Because agriculture problems. Anywho, Saskatchewan was hit with drought, grasshoppers, hails, and crop failure during the Great Depression. Drought as in lack of water to water the plants, so plants went. And then grasshoppers that used to munch on the wheat because they love eating grain, and if a grasshopper munch on the wheat, it turns bad. And then hail, like the weather in general was not good for Saskatchewan during this time, not to mention that a lot of people were actively losing money during this time, and so it's not like they could just keep planting over and over again because that cost money and money was tight, and so agriculture faced a huge hit, including crop failures. So much so, agriculture in Saskatchewan got so bad that in 1937, 2/3 of Saskatchewan's entire farm industry was unoperated, meaning no one was growing within these farms. 2 out of 3. So that is around 75% of Saskatchewan was not producing crops, like farmland wise. And then I split it up into government, because also the government of Saskatchewan and its surrounding provinces and the federal government of Canada also had a huge role for how they helped Saskatchewan during this time. And so let's just talk about another big problem Saskatchewan faced, and that was 250,000 people in Saskatchewan left during the Great Depression from 1931 to 1941. And the reason is because there's no work in Saskatchewan, agriculture stopped producing work, and not to mention people were losing their houses and their jobs and their way of life in Saskatchewan, and so many of these people ended up going somewhere else to either look for work, go back to families in different provinces, or just, I don't know, start a better life in a tough life. Provincial aid. So provincial aid was the aid that came between Manitoba and Alberta and Northwest Territories and Nunavut and all the surrounding provinces and territories that helped Saskatchewan during this time. So here's the problem too. Saskatchewan faced a huge agriculture hit, worse than the other provinces, but that doesn't mean the other provinces were completely good. They also had their own problems. And so because all these provinces were supplying aid to Saskatchewan, they also were losing crops for the people over there. So you kind of see where the problem is, right? There's nothing here, and Manitoba gives, for example, we'll say 25% to Saskatchewan, and Alberta another 25%, and let's say both of their agriculture rates are at a 50-50%, meaning 50% being produced while the other 50 isn't. They take away 25, so only 25% of that total produce is being for the people of Alberta and Manitoba, and then 50 goes to Saskatchewan for all the people over here also have food. So big problem, you know, and there's like a domino effect. If one province starts to fail, all of them around them will fail. And so provincial aid, very important. And then the Royal Commission, let's talk about that. The Royal Commission ranked Saskatchewan as the province that will hit the absolute worst during the Great Depression. Because not only did they lose jobs, and not only was their economy bad, and not only did so many people leave, and not only was agriculture failing, but they just got hit the absolute worst. And so they rated it as number one, as the one that was devastated the most. And then we have the CCF, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which was a political party that existed at the time, not anymore. It was founded in 1932 and lasted until 1961. The entire purpose of that political party and all the people that were part of this political party was only to help Saskatchewan, well, not Saskatchewan, kind of just the entire agriculture business, to ensure that this never happens again, kind of have a fail-safe. And so they started protesting, or not protesting, but fighting politically to ensure that if this ever does happen again, like another Great Depression, they had a backup plan. So they created plans. They put money on the side for these farms. They tried to reduce their tax rate to make sure that they weren't being taxed as much as any other job. Because if you begin to tax agriculture a lot, then people are either not gonna do it or are gonna fall behind payments. And if the money goes down on their business, the entire industry goes down on their business. And so they just wanted to make sure that this mistake that happened during the Great Depression never happens again. And so bravo to those guys. So they stopped operations in 1961. That's when they realized, hey, our job's done, let's get out of here. And so with that being said, we have the Great Depression off the list. All right, folks, we have reached our end. Yes, I know I ended it basically as far as 1941, and there's still a lot of history yet to talk about. But two issues. One, this video is way too long, and I know for a fact none of you guys made it this far. And two, this is my chance to kind of let you guys, folks of Saskatchewan, if there even is anyone from Saskatchewan here, to kind of talk of how Saskatchewan has been doing lately. So with that being said, let's now go to Regina, Saskatchewan. Alright guys, basically that is the end of the video. I did end up going to Regina. I will show a clip at the very end. Just be aware, it is extremely loud, which is why I didn't record there, since there was a lot of wind, and basically I don't have the microphone to get good audio quality, so I decided to not record anything. The original plan was to interview Andrew Stevens, who is a city councilor in Ward 3 of Regina, but things didn't work out as planned, and so we are still trying to get that interview, but hopefully instead of in person, it's going to be through Zoom. And so I will just post that video differently, just because I kind of want to get this video out of the way to focus on my next one. And so with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed it. Like, subscribe, please. I am tired. So yeah, see ya. Super cold here, even though I got a trench coat and a beanie. I am still freezing. But yeah, I am here to do my little vlog. Look at the flags.